Hey guys, in our world of seamless indoor plumbing and privacy at the touch of a handle, it's easy to assume that going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was nothing more than a crude, chaotic scramble, filth everywhere, no thought given to comfort or order. But the truth is more layered, more uncomfortable in its everyday realities, and far more revealing about how people actually lived. A time when this most basic human necessity was shaped by class, architecture, religious routine, and the quiet ingenuity born of real material limits, turning something we take for granted into a daily negotiation that most modern viewers barely pause to imagine. Where are you watching from tonight, and what history topic would you like to hear next? If this kind of calm, thoughtful exploration of the past feels like the right way to wind down, a quiet like would mean a great deal in supporting more of these long-form documentaries. And if you'd like to settle into more of these unhurried journeys through how people really lived, I invite you to subscribe so the next one finds you easily. To truly understand what it was like, we have to begin not with the shock of what was missing, but with what was present, systems that made practical sense to those who built and used them, even if they strike us today as deeply unpleasant. The Middle Ages, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries across Europe, inherited a Roman legacy of public baths and sewers that gradually faded in the early centuries after the empire's collapse. What replaced it was not total anarchy, but a patchwork of solutions tailored to rural villages, bustling towns, stone castles, and walled monasteries. People were not indifferent to waste. Humoral medicine taught them that bodily balance mattered, and religious teaching emphasized modesty and cleanliness of the soul, if not always of the streets. Yet the practical constraints were immense. Water had to be carried by hand, wood for fires was precious, and the labor of removing waste fell to servants, laborers, or the night soil men who worked under cover of darkness. What viewers often misunderstand is that medieval people lived with smells and sights we would find intolerable not because they lacked standards, but because their world operated under different pressures that made certain compromises feel ordinary rather than outrageous. Let us begin with the world of the nobility and the great stone castles that still loom in our imaginations. For a lord, a lady, or their household, the primary facility was often the garderobe, a small private closet built into the thick castle wall, sometimes projecting outward like a stone box so that waste could drop straight down a long chute into the moat, a river, or a deep cesspit below. These were not luxurious rooms. They were cold, drafty spaces with little more than a wooden seat pierced by a hole, sometimes lined with a simple cushion for those who could afford it. In winter, the chill of the stone could be biting, and the vertical chute acted like a natural vent, drawing up cold air and, on warmer days, the unmistakable odor of accumulated waste. Privacy was relative. Servants might wait just outside, and in many castles the garderobe was placed near bedchambers so that the lord or lady could relieve themselves without crossing the great hall in the middle of the night. Chamber pots, earthenware or metal vessels, often kept under the bed or in a close stool, a wooden box designed to look like furniture, served for emergencies or for women who preferred not to venture into the garderobe after dark. A servant would empty these each morning, carrying them down winding stairs to be dumped outside the walls or into the castle's main cesspit. The wiping materials tell their own quiet story of adaptation. Soft wool, linen rags, or even a handful of hay or moss gathered from the countryside were common. In some households, a sponge on a stick, rinsed in a bucket of water or vinegar, served the purpose in a manner echoing older Roman customs. There was no toilet paper as we know it, and the practical choice reflected what was available rather than any indifference to hygiene. Lords and ladies might have their personal cloths, laundered by servants, while the smell that clung to clothing and hair was simply part of life. Perfumes, herbs, and frequent changes of undergarments helped mask it for those who could afford such small luxuries. Medical writers of the period advised moderation in all things, warning that holding in bodily functions could upset the humors, so the garderobe or chamber pot was used promptly, without shame in the privacy of one's rank. Yet even here, discomfort was built in. The chute could freeze in harsh winters, backing up and requiring manual clearing. Rats and other vermin sometimes made their way up the shafts. And on campaign or during travel, the entire system vanished. A noble might simply use a portable close stool carried by servants or step behind a screen in the tent. What feels surprising to many today is how these arrangements were woven into the daily rhythm of castle life rather than hidden away as something embarrassing. Guests might be shown to a garderobe upon arrival as a gesture of hospitality. In some grander residences, multiple garderobes served different floors, their placement carefully chosen by the architect to avoid contaminating the well water or the kitchens. The waste itself was not simply ignored. When the cesspit filled, it was emptied by hired laborers who carted the contents, known as night soil, to nearby fields as fertilizer, a practice that made perfect sense in an agricultural society where every resource counted. This recycling was pragmatic, even valued. Human waste enriched the soil for the very crops that fed the household. So while the immediate experience could be unpleasant, the cold seat, the echoing drop, the pervasive odor, the system worked within the limits of medieval engineering and labor. Of course, these comforts belonged to the few. The vast majority of people lived far simpler lives in the countryside, where the bathroom was not a room at all but the world outside. Peasant cottages, built of wattle and daub with thatched roofs, rarely had dedicated latrines. Most families relieved themselves in the fields, the woods, or behind the byre where animals were kept. A shallow pit dug some distance from the dwelling served as an informal privy for the household, covered with earth when full and relocated as needed. Chamber pots were common even in modest homes. Simple pottery vessels emptied each morning into the yard or the nearest ditch. Children learned early to manage without privacy. The rhythms of farm life left little room for delicacy. In summer, the smells blended with those of livestock and ripening hay. In winter, the frozen ground made the task harder, and many preferred to wait until daylight rather than venture out into the snow. Religious belief still shaped behavior. Monks and nuns followed strict rules, but for lay people the church taught that the body's functions were natural, though modesty was expected in public. Even so, small customs emerged to manage the inevitable. Some villages designated certain areas for waste, and local customs discouraged fouling streams used for drinking or washing. The practical reality, however, was that waste often found its way into shared spaces, and heavy rain could turn paths into muddy channels carrying more than just water. This was not seen as catastrophic. It was the background noise of rural existence, accepted much as we accept traffic sounds today. The discomfort came in waves, during harvest when every hand was needed, or in times of illness when the body's demands grew more urgent and the distance to the privy felt greater. Yet within these constraints, people maintained a kind of order. Families knew the safest spots, the times of day when privacy was easiest, and the materials at hand for cleaning. The assumption that medieval peasants lived in squalor without noticing is too simple. They noticed, adapted, and passed their solutions down through generations. As we move from the countryside into the growing towns and cities of the later Middle Ages, the picture grows more crowded and more regulated. Urban populations brought new pressures. Streets in places like London, Paris, or York were often narrow, unpaved, and lined with houses whose upper stories jutted out, sometimes allowing residents to empty chamber pots from windows with a warning cry of gardyloo, a corruption of the French gardyloo, or look out for the water. City authorities issued ordinances against such practices, fining offenders and requiring residents to use public latrines built over rivers or specially dug cesspits. These public facilities could be surprisingly elaborate. Multi-seated benches over a flowing stream, sometimes staffed or maintained by the town. In monastic institutions attached to towns, the reredorer, the monk's latrine, featured long rows of stone seats with individual partitions, flushed by diverted streams, reflecting the order and cleanliness prized by religious communities. The contrast with the surrounding streets could be stark. Yet it showed that when resources and organization allowed, medieval builders could create systems that approached Roman efficiency. The labor behind all of this remained human and often thankless. Night soil collectors worked the hours of darkness, their carts rumbling through the streets, the contents sold to farmers outside the walls. In some cities, guilds regulated the trade. In others, it was left to the poorest laborers. The smell of their work clung to them, marking them as a necessary but lowly part of urban life. Meanwhile, medical treatises warned of the dangers of corrupted air from waste, linking foul odors to outbreaks of disease, though the precise mechanisms remained mysterious until much later. People burned herbs, scattered rushes on floors, and washed their hands before meals. Small rituals that spoke to an awareness of cleanliness, even when the larger environment resisted control. The experience varied not only by place but by the rhythms of the day and the seasons. At night, the chamber pot or garderobe became essential. Daylight brought the possibility of walking farther for privacy or relief. Feasts and festivals meant fuller bellies and more frequent use. Travel, whether pilgrimage, trade, or war, stripped away even these modest arrangements, forcing improvisation along roadsides or in makeshift camps. Through it all ran a quiet thread of acceptance. This was how bodies worked, how communities managed, and how life continued. The discomfort was real, the odors pervasive, yet woven so deeply into daily existence that they rarely provoked the kind of revulsion we might feel looking back. Instead, they were simply the texture of the world. And as the centuries progressed, subtle shifts began to appear: tighter city regulations, improved castle designs, growing trade in better quality pottery for chamber pots. But the fundamental realities remained rooted in the same constraints of labor, water, and wood. The story of the medieval bathroom is not one of uniform misery or uniform ingenuity. It is one of people making do with what they had, shaping small comforts where they could, and living in a world where even the most private acts connected them to the larger systems of agriculture, architecture, and belief that sustained their society. What lay ahead for those in the growing towns, however, was a different scale of challenge, one where the sheer density of human life tested those same practical solutions in ways the countryside rarely demanded. What lay ahead for those in the growing towns, however, was a different scale of challenge, one where the sheer density of human life tested those same practical solutions in ways the countryside rarely demanded. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as trade revived and populations swelled within the protective walls of places like London, Paris, Ghent, and Florence, the narrow streets and timber-framed houses created a world where private arrangements collided constantly with public necessity. Chamber pots were still emptied from upper windows with the familiar cry of warning, yet civic authorities had begun to push back against the practice with increasing vigor. In London, for instance, the mayor and aldermen issued repeated ordinances requiring residents to carry their waste to designated laystalls, open dumps outside the walls, or to use the public latrines built at key points along the Thames and the Fleet River. These public facilities were often simple wooden or stone structures perched over the water, with rows of seats offering little in the way of partitions. On busy market days, the benches could be crowded, the flow of the river below doing its imperfect best to carry waste away, though at low tide the accumulated filth could become all too visible and all too pungent. The lived experience for an ordinary townsman or woman was one of constant negotiation with these shared spaces. A merchant rising before dawn might use a close stool in the upper chamber of his shophouse, handing the vessel to an apprentice who would hurry it down to the street and then to the nearest public privy or riverbank. For women, especially those managing households with children, the rhythm was more constrained. Modesty dictated that they avoid the most exposed public seats during daylight hours if possible, relying instead on chamber pots carried discreetly or on quick visits to a neighbor's yard where a shared pit had been dug. The streets themselves, unpaved in many quarters and running with rainwater mixed with whatever had been tossed out overnight, required careful footing. Leather shoes or wooden pattens offered some protection. Yet the pervasive damp and odor seeped into daily life in ways that modern sensibilities can scarcely imagine without discomfort. Yet within this apparent disorder lay a quiet logic. Waste was not merely discarded but often collected by licensed rakers and gong farmers, men who specialized in clearing cesspits and gutters, whose labor fed a modest but essential economy. The contents, once hauled beyond the walls, enriched market gardens and orchards that supplied the very food sold back in the town squares. This cycle, imperfect and malodorous as it was, sustained the urban metabolism just as surely as the garderobes sustained the castles. What many today assume was pure indifference to hygiene was, in reality, a matter of balancing competing pressures. Medical writers drawing on Galen and Hippocrates emphasized the importance of regular evacuation to prevent the buildup of corrupt humors, and household manuals advised keeping latrines or pits at a safe distance from wells and food stores. In prosperous merchant homes, tiled floors and fresh rushes helped absorb spills, while vinegar rinses for sponges or cloths offered a small measure of cleanliness. Religious houses within the towns provided a striking contrast and, in their way, a model of what organized effort could achieve. The great monasteries and nunneries maintained reredoors, long, vaulted latrine blocks with individual stone seats separated by low partitions, flushed continuously by a diverted stream or rainwater channel. Monks and nuns followed strict timetables for use, washing their hands afterward at nearby lavatoria basins, their routines shaped as much by the rule of Saint Benedict as by practical engineering. These facilities were cleaned regularly by lay brothers, and the waste was directed to fish ponds or fields where it supported the abbey's self-sufficiency. The very existence of such systems in religious communities quietly challenged the notion that medieval people simply accepted filth. When resources, labor, and institutional discipline aligned, they built solutions that approached the efficiency of earlier Roman designs. Still, for the majority outside these ordered walls, the daily realities remained grounded in improvisation and endurance. In the crowded tenements of a city like York or Bristol, a family of 5 or 6 might share a single-chamber pot passed among them at night, its contents carried down steep stairs each morning by the youngest member. During outbreaks of illness, dysentery, or the flux that flared in warm months, the demands on these arrangements intensified, turning a routine task into a source of quiet anxiety. Public bathhouses, or stews, offered another layer to the story. Though often associated in popular imagination with vice, many served as places where townsfolk could wash their bodies and, in some cases, attend to personal needs in a more communal setting. Heated by wood fires and supplied with buckets of water, these were not daily luxuries but occasional respites, especially valued before feast days or after long journeys. The water itself, drawn from rivers or wells, was rarely pure by our standards, yet the act of washing represented a deliberate effort at bodily care that coexisted with the broader environment of shared waste. As the 14th century unfolded, these urban pressures grew more acute with the dramatic rise and fall of populations. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350, though it ravaged communities and left many towns temporarily quieter, did not immediately transform sanitation practices. Instead, it underscored the existing vulnerabilities. In the years following, some cities responded with renewed vigor, widening streets, mandating better placement of privies, and fining those who fouled public spaces more heavily. London's ordinances grew stricter, requiring householders to clean the street frontage outside their doors, while Paris saw the expansion of covered sewers in certain quarters. Yet these improvements were uneven. The labor shortages after the plague meant that gong farmers and rakers could sometimes command higher wages, but the sheer volume of waste from a recovering population still tested the limits of hand-carried systems and river flows. For a craftsman in a narrow alley, the garderobe chute built into a new stone house represented genuine progress, cold and echoing as it might be, while his neighbor in a timber hovel continued to rely on the yard pit or the street itself. The contrast highlighted how architecture, wealth, and civic enforcement shaped the most intimate moments of the day. Gender and age added further layers to the experience. Young children learned early to manage without the privacy adults prized, often relieving themselves in the yard or behind the house under the watchful eye of an older sibling. Women of childbearing age, managing both household duties and the physical demands of pregnancy or recovery, found chamber pots an essential companion, sometimes kept warm with a hot brick in winter to ease discomfort. Men engaged in trades that took them away from home, blacksmiths, carters, or laborers, might step into a convenient alley or use a public latrine during their long workdays, their routines dictated by the location of their labor rather than convenience. Pilgrims and travelers passing through towns faced their own set of improvisations. Roadside bushes on the approach roads, or paying a small fee to use a monastery's facilities if they were fortunate enough to secure lodging there. Through all these variations ran a common thread of acceptance shaped by necessity. The body's needs were acknowledged openly in medical texts and religious sermons alike, yet handled with the quiet pragmatism that defined so much of medieval life. By the 15th century, as the Middle Ages drew toward their close, signs of gradual refinement appeared in the wealthiest quarters and in the growing centers of commerce. Some Italian city-states experimented with more systematic drainage, while English and French nobles commissioned castle renovations that included better ventilated garderobes and separate facilities for servants. Trade in finer pottery produced chamber pots with decorative glazes, small comforts that spoke to rising standards among the urban middle classes. Public latrines in places like the one at London Bridge, with its 20 seats and regular maintenance, became points of modest civic pride rather than mere necessity. And yet the fundamental constraints of water carriage, wood scarcity, and human labor remained. The smells that rose from the streets on a warm summer evening, the careful navigation of muddy lanes after rain, the nightly ritual of the chamber pot. These were not anomalies but the steady background of existence for millions. They connected the lord in his tower to the peasant in his field and the merchant in his shophouse in a shared human reality that was at once practical, uncomfortable, and deeply embedded in the rhythms of the age. What becomes clear when we linger on these details is how the act of relieving oneself was never isolated from the larger structures of society. Its economy, its faith, its building techniques, and its unspoken understandings of health and propriety. The discomfort was real, the solutions imperfect, but they functioned within a world that valued order, resourcefulness, and communal survival in ways that continue to reward careful attention. And as we turn our gaze toward the closing decades of the 15th century, those same pressures and adaptations were beginning to encounter new influences, new trade routes, new ideas of cleanliness, and new architectural ambitions that would quietly reshape even this most basic aspect of daily life in the centuries that followed. These new influences, new trade routes, new ideas of cleanliness, and new architectural ambitions that would quietly reshape even this most basic aspect of daily life. In the centuries that followed began to appear first in the prosperous trading cities of the Low Countries, northern Italy, and the Rhineland, where merchant wealth and the slow dissemination of printed medical texts encouraged modest refinements rather than wholesale reinvention. In the 1480s and 1490s, a prosperous cloth merchant in Bruges or a silk trader in Florence might still rely on a chamber pot of fine glazed earthenware tucked beneath a carved wooden close stool in the upper sleeping chamber. Yet the vessel itself was now more likely to be emptied not into the street but carried by a servant to one of the expanding network of public latrines maintained by civic guilds. These public facilities, often built over rivers or specially engineered channels, had grown more numerous in response to repeated council ordinances that fined householders for fouling the gutters or allowing cesspits to overflow. In London alone, by the later decades of the 15th century, more than a dozen such latrines served the densely packed wards, some perched on bridges where the tidal flow of the Thames helped carry waste away, their wooden or stone seats arranged in rows that offered little privacy but at least a measure of communal order. Wardens were paid to inspect and maintain them, scraping accumulated filth and ensuring the structures did not collapse under the weight of constant use. A small but telling sign that urban authorities viewed the management of waste as a civic responsibility rather than an inevitable nuisance. What strikes many modern listeners as paradoxical is how these late medieval towns balanced increasing regulation with the persistence of long-familiar habits. A housewife in York, rising at first light to prepare the morning meal, might still use a simple pottery chamber pot for herself and her children before handing it to an apprentice who would hurry it down narrow stairs and along the street to the nearest designated lay stall outside the walls. The journey was brief, the odor familiar, and the contents would later be sold to market gardeners who valued the nitrogen-rich night soil for their leeks and cabbages. Civic bylaws required each householder to sweep the street frontage weekly and to keep privies at a safe distance from wells, yet enforcement depended on the vigilance of local constables and the willingness of neighbors to report violations. In practice, heavy rain could still turn alleys into open sewers, and the smell of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and stables mingled with human waste in a way that residents simply accepted as the price of urban life. Medical treatises circulating in manuscript and, increasingly, in early printed editions continued to stress the importance of regular bodily evacuation to maintain humoral balance, advising against suppressing natural urges and recommending mild purges when necessary. Yet these texts rarely proposed radical new designs. Instead, they reinforced the value of the systems already in place, urging only that they be used with greater attention to cleanliness of the person afterward. In the great stone residences of the nobility, the traditional garderobe remained the centerpiece of private convenience, though architects in the later 15th century sometimes incorporated small improvements born of accumulated experience. At castles like Bodiam in Sussex or the more modernized towers along the Scottish borders, multiple garderobes served different floors, their chutes angled to drop waste well clear of living quarters and into moats or rivers below. Some lords even commissioned ventilated shafts that drew air upward more effectively, reducing the backdraft of odors into the bedchamber. The dual purpose of certain garderobes, as both privy and wardrobe, persisted as a pragmatic solution. Valuable woolen garments and furs hung on pegs within the stone chamber absorbed the ammonia fumes rising from the shaft, which helped repel moths and fleas in an era before chemical treatments. A servant would periodically shake out the clothes and beat them in the courtyard, accepting the faint residual scent as the cost of preservation. Chamber pots, now often fitted with close-fitting lids and handles for easier carrying, accompanied noble travelers on progress through the countryside, where the absence of fixed facilities made portability essential. During hunts or military musters, portable wooden stools with leather buckets served the same purpose, emptied discreetly by pages who had grown accustomed to the task as part of their service. The experience varied sharply by region and by season, revealing how climate and local resources shaped even the most intimate routines. In the milder south of France or the Italian city-states, where stone construction was more widespread and water sources more reliable, some merchant houses experimented with small internal latrines connected to covered drains that led to communal cesspools maintained by the commune. These were still hand-emptied, but the stone flooring and tiled walls allowed for easier rinsing with buckets drawn from cisterns. Further north, in the damp, timber-built towns of England and the German lands, wooden privies built over backyard pits remained the norm for all but the wealthiest, their seats sometimes lined with straw or moss gathered fresh each week. Winter brought its own quiet hardships. Frozen chutes in castles required servants to climb down with iron hooks to clear blockages, while in rural cottages the ground outside might be too hard for digging, forcing greater reliance on chamber pots kept near the hearth for warmth. Religious observance continued to frame these acts with quiet dignity. Monastic communities, ever the custodians of order, maintained their long reared orders with the same disciplined routines that had served them for centuries, the steady flow of diverted streams flushing the long stone benches and carrying waste to abbey fields where it nourished the very crops that sustained the brothers and sisters. Public bathhouses, or stews, offered another layer of personal care that gained renewed popularity in certain urban centers during the late 15th century. Though sometimes viewed with suspicion by moralists, many operated as respectable establishments where townsfolk could soak in heated wooden tubs, scrub with coarse cloths, and attend to basic bodily needs in relative seclusion before returning home. The water, drawn from rivers or wells and heated by wood fires, was changed only infrequently, yet the ritual of bathing before major feast days or after illness represented a deliberate effort at bodily refreshment that coexisted comfortably with the broader realities of waste management. For the laboring classes, apprentices, journeymen, and market women, these facilities provided a rare moment of warmth and privacy that the crowded tenements could not. Meanwhile, the night soil trade continued to thrive as a modest but essential occupation. Licensed collectors moved through the streets after midnight, their carts rumbling over cobblestones, the contents weighed and sold by the load to farmers who waited at the gates. The work was arduous and malodorous, yet it formed part of a closed loop that sustained the agricultural hinterland feeding the towns, an economy of waste that modern eyes might overlook but that medieval people understood as both necessary and valuable. As the 15th century edged toward its close, these layered practices, private garderobes for the elite, public latrines for the urban many, chamber pots and yard pits for the rest, reflected a society that had refined its medieval inheritance without abandoning its core constraints. The arrival of printed broadsheets and household manuals in the 1490s began to spread practical advice on everything from the proper placement of privies to the use of aromatic herbs for masking odors, yet the advice built upon rather than replaced the systems already in daily use. In the workshops of masons and carpenters, new commissions for town halls or merchant halls sometimes included integrated latrine blocks modeled on monastic designs, their stone seats and water channels representing the quiet ambition of civic pride. Travelers returning from the Levant or the recently established Portuguese trading posts along the African coast occasionally brought stories of more elaborate Eastern facilities. Yet these tales remained curiosities rather than catalysts for immediate change. The labor, materials, and social organization required for large-scale Roman-style aqueducts simply did not exist in most European contexts. Instead, people continued to adapt within the world they knew, balancing the body's insistent rhythms with the limits of hand labor, seasonal weather, and communal regulation. The quiet ingenuity of these arrangements becomes especially clear when one considers the daily negotiation faced by a typical family in a late medieval townhouse. A master weaver and his wife might rise before dawn, use the close stool in the solar, then send their eldest son to carry the vessel to the public privy 2 streets away while the younger children relieved themselves in the small yard behind the workshop. The floor would be swept and fresh rushes scattered, the air sweetened with dried lavender if the household could afford it. At midday, apprentices returning from errands would pause at a riverside latrine before eating, while the mistress, managing the household accounts by candlelight in the evening, kept a chamber pot close at hand rather than venture downstairs after dark. These rhythms repeated across thousands of households, shaped by the same practical considerations that had guided their grandparents. Water was heavy to carry, wood for heating was costly, and time spent on sanitation competed with the demands of trade, craft, and devotion. The discomfort was real. The chill of stone in winter, the pervasive background odor that clung to clothing, the occasional overflow during floods. But it was managed with a matter-of-fact acceptance that allowed daily life to proceed without constant complaint. Even in the countryside, where change arrived more slowly, the late 15th century saw subtle shifts in response to growing market demands. Larger villages near prosperous market towns sometimes dug deeper communal pits lined with wattle and daub, shared by several families and relocated every few years when full. Peasant households that supplied wool or grain to urban merchants might acquire better quality pottery chamber pots through trade, small luxuries that eased the burden of nighttime use. Religious houses continued to serve as models of orderly sanitation, their reread orders and lavatoria demonstrating what disciplined communal effort could achieve, even without advanced technology. Pilgrims traveling the great routes to Compostela or Canterbury relied on the hospitality of monasteries along the way, where the facilities were cleaner and more predictable than those found in wayside inns. Through all these variations, the central truth endured. The act of relieving oneself remained deeply embedded in the material and social fabric of the age, a daily reminder of both human vulnerability and human resourcefulness. And as the new century dawned, with its expanding horizons of exploration and its gradual shifts in architectural taste and medical understanding, the medieval systems of garderobes, chamber pots, public latrines, and night soil collection would not vanish overnight but instead carry forward, adapting slowly to fresh pressures while retaining the practical logic that had sustained generations. These medieval systems, though rooted in centuries of practice, began to encounter subtle new influences as the 16th century unfolded, yet they adapted with the same quiet pragmatism that had defined them for generations rather than giving way to sudden transformation. In the early decades of the 1500s, across the towns and countryside of England, France, the Low Countries, and the Italian states, the garderobe, the chamber pot, and the public latrine remained the unremarkable backbone of daily relief. Their forms familiar even as printed medical manuals and expanding trade introduced small refinements that eased rather than replaced the old routines. A prosperous merchant in Antwerp or a wool trader in Calais might now own a set of chamber pots glazed with brighter lead-based colors imported through new Atlantic routes, their lids fitting more snugly to contain odors during the night hours. Yet the vessel was still carried down steep stairs each morning by a servant or apprentice and emptied into a civic cesspit or the nearest riverbank under the watchful eye of town wardens. Civic ordinances in places like London under the early Tudors grew more detailed, requiring householders to maintain their street frontages and to use designated lay stalls rather than tossing waste from windows, with fines levied in the consistory courts for repeat offenders. The cry of gardyloo faded in some quarters as enforcement tightened, but the underlying reliance on hand labor and flowing water stayed constant. What feels quietly revealing is how these adaptations reflected not a rejection of medieval ways but a gentle evolution within the same material limits. Medical texts printed on the new presses, works drawing on both Galen and emerging observations from university physicians, continued to emphasize the necessity of prompt evacuation to preserve humoral balance, advising readers to keep close stools near the bedchamber and to rinse sponges or linen cloths with vinegar or rosewater afterward. In a typical urban household of the 1520s, the rhythm remained much as it had been a century earlier, the master and mistress using a carved wooden close stool in the solar before dawn, the children and servants relying on shared pottery vessels emptied into the yard or carried to the public facilities 2 or 3 streets away. Fresh rushes still covered the floors, now sometimes mixed with herbs brought back from Levantine trade, their scent helping to mask the background odors that no amount of regulation could fully eliminate. In winter, the stone or timber walls of the privy chamber retained their chill, and servants tasked with clearing blocked chutes or hauling night soil wrapped their faces in cloths against the fumes, accepting the work as an ordinary part of service in a world where every resource, including human waste, found its way back to the fields. Castles and great houses of the nobility showed similar continuity, with modest improvements born of accumulated experience rather than revolutionary design. At residences like Hampton Court under Cardinal Wolsey or the refurbished towers along the Loire, garderobes were still built into the thickness of the walls, their chutes now sometimes lined with smoother stone to ease cleaning and angled more precisely to drop waste well clear of the kitchens and wells. A visiting noble might be offered the use of a private garderobe upon arrival as a mark of hospitality, while servants and lower members of the household relied on communal facilities or chamber pots carried discreetly through the corridors. The dual use of some garderobes as wardrobes persisted, the ammonia rising from the shaft continuing to protect stored woolens and furs from moths, an economical solution that spoke volumes about the value placed on practical ingenuity over aesthetic refinement. Portable close stools traveled with hunting parties and royal progresses, their leather buckets emptied by pages who had learned the task as part of their training. The discomfort of cold nights or jostling carts was simply part of the rhythm of movement across the landscape. In the countryside, where change arrived more gradually, peasant households maintained their long-standing arrangements with the same matter-of-fact acceptance. A yeoman farmer in the English Midlands or a tenant in the French hinterlands might now possess a sturdier chamber pot acquired at the local market, yet it was still emptied each morning into a backyard pit or carried to a communal village laystall shared by several families. The pit itself, dug deeper than in earlier centuries to accommodate slightly larger households, was covered with earth and relocated every few years when full, its contents spread on the fields that grew the family's rye and barley. Children learned the routines early, stepping behind the byre or into the woods for privacy during the day, while women managing pregnancies or young infants kept a warm chamber pot near the hearth to ease nighttime use. Religious life continued to frame these acts with quiet dignity. Parish priests reminded congregations in sermons that the body's functions were natural creations of God, to be handled with modesty but without undue shame, and monastic houses, many of them still thriving before the coming storms of reform, maintained their reared orders with the disciplined efficiency that had served them since the 12th century. The long stone benches, flushed by diverted streams, offered a model of order that lay people admired even if they could not replicate it at home. Public facilities in the larger towns reflected the same blend of continuity and incremental adjustment. In Paris or Ghent, the multi-seated latrines built over rivers or specially dug channels were inspected more regularly by civic officials, their wooden seats sometimes replaced with smoother stone and provided with buckets of water for rinsing. On market days, the benches filled quickly, the flow beneath doing its imperfect work while users exchanged the brief, practical conversation of shared necessity. Bathhouses or stews remained popular in certain quarters as places where townsfolk could wash away the day's accumulated grime, the heated tubs and coarse cloths offering a modest luxury that complemented rather than replaced the daily routines of the privy. The night soil trade continued as a modest but vital occupation. Licensed collectors moved through the streets in the small hours, their carts now sometimes fitted with tighter covers to reduce spills, the contents sold by the load to market gardeners who supplied the very vegetables sold back in the town squares. This closed loop of waste and fertility remained one of the era's most understated efficiencies, a reminder that what modern eyes might view as mere filth was, to contemporaries, a resource carefully husbanded. The lived experience for individuals varied not only by class and location but by the turning of the seasons and the rhythms of work and faith. In the summer months, when the days lengthened and markets bustled, the frequency of use increased with richer diets and longer hours in the fields or workshops. Heavy rains could swell rivers and overflow cesspits, turning familiar paths into muddy channels that required careful navigation in pattens or wooden clogs. Winter brought the opposite challenge: frozen ground and icy chutes that demanded extra labor from servants armed with iron hooks and buckets of hot water. Feasts and fast days alike shaped the body's demands. The rich fare of a guild banquet might send apprentices hurrying to the nearest public latrine, while the sparse Lenten meals reduced the need for relief but heightened awareness of the body's fragility. Pilgrims on the roads to Compostela or Walsingham relied on wayside monasteries for cleaner facilities, their journeys marked by the small comforts of a well-maintained reared order or a shared chamber pot offered by charitable hosts. Through all these variations ran the same underlying acceptance. The systems worked because they had to, shaped by the same constraints of labor, water, and wood that had guided medieval life for centuries. Even as the Reformation began to stir in the 1520s and 1530s, with its challenges to monastic institutions and its emphasis on personal discipline, the practical arrangements of daily relief changed more slowly than the theological debates that surrounded them. Some dissolved monasteries saw their reared orders repurposed or left to decay, yet the knowledge of orderly sanitation passed into lay hands through printed manuals and the experience of former monks who entered secular service. In England under Henry VIII, royal ordinances for the royal palaces introduced slightly more sophisticated drainage in new wings, yet the majority of subjects, noble, merchant, and peasant alike, continued with the garderobes, chamber pots, and public latrines they had always known. The printing press, while spreading new ideas about health and the body, largely reinforced the value of the old practices rather than proposing radical alternatives. Household guides advised the same placement of privies away from wells, the same use of aromatic herbs, and the same regular emptying of cesspits. The discomfort remained real. The pervasive background odors that no herb could fully banish, the chill of stone in winter, the occasional overflow during floods, but it was managed with the same resourcefulness that had sustained generations before. As the middle decades of the 16th century approached, these medieval-rooted systems stood at a quiet threshold, carrying the practical logic of the past into an age of expanding horizons while still answering the body's unchanging needs in ways that felt both familiar and enduring. The trade in spices and new plants from distant lands added subtle layers to the masking of odors, and architectural tastes in the grander houses began to favor slightly more private arrangements. Yet the core reliance on hand-carried waste, river flows, and night soil collection persisted as the steady background of existence for millions. In the workshops of masons and carpenters, commissions for new town halls or merchant residences sometimes included integrated latrine blocks modeled on older monastic designs, their stone seats and channels representing continuity rather than rupture. Travelers returning from the New World or the Ottoman lands brought back stories of different facilities. Yet these remained curiosities that did little to alter the daily realities at home. The quiet ingenuity of the age lay in its ability to absorb new influences without discarding what had proven reliable across centuries of change. What becomes especially clear in these transitional years is how the most private of acts remained deeply connected to the larger structures of society. Its economy of labor and agriculture, its religious understandings of the body, and its communal efforts at order. The discomfort was never hidden. It was simply lived with, adapted to, and woven into the fabric of ordinary days in ways that reward careful attention even now. And as political and religious upheavals gathered strength across Europe, those same systems would face new pressures from population shifts, urban growth, and the gradual spread of ideas about cleanliness that had been stirring quietly for decades. Those same systems would face new pressures from population shifts, urban growth, and the gradual spread of ideas about cleanliness that had been stirring quietly for decades. Yet the core arrangements of garderobes, chamber pots, and public latrines proved remarkably resilient even as the religious and political landscapes shifted beneath them. The Reformation that gathered momentum through the 1530s and 1540s brought dramatic changes to the monastic world, where many of the most orderly sanitation facilities had long stood as models of disciplined efficiency. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII saw hundreds of reredoors, those long, vaulted blocks with their stone seats and steady water channels, abandoned or repurposed as the abbeys themselves were granted to new owners or stripped for building materials. Lay brothers and former monks who had maintained these systems carried their practical knowledge into secular households and civic roles. But the immediate effect in many regions was a temporary loss of institutional order rather than an improvement. Civic authorities stepped in where they could, issuing fresh ordinances that required towns to maintain their public latrines with greater regularity. Yet the labor shortages created by the upheavals meant that night soil collectors and rakers sometimes found their work more demanding than ever before. In the growing cities, the same hand-carried routines persisted, now serving larger populations whose numbers had begun to swell steadily after the earlier plagues. What many modern listeners might not anticipate is how these religious changes, far from sweeping away medieval practices, often reinforced them through new forms of regulation and printed advice. Protestant household manuals and sermons continued to stress the naturalness of bodily functions while urging modesty and prompt evacuation to preserve health, echoing the humoral teachings that had guided earlier generations. In a typical merchant household in mid-16th century London or Antwerp, the morning ritual remained familiar, the master and mistress using a close stool of polished oak in the upper chamber, its pottery insert now sometimes adorned with simple floral patterns from local kilns, while servants carried the contents down to the street and onward to a designated lay stall beyond the walls. The cry of warning from windows had largely faded in better regulated wards, replaced by the steady traffic of apprentices and maids making their way to public facilities perched over the Thames or the Seine. These public latrines, maintained by wardens paid from civic funds, offered rows of seats that could accommodate a dozen or more at peak hours, their wooden or stone benches worn smooth by constant use and occasionally provided with a bucket of river water for rinsing. The flow beneath still did its imperfect work, yet the sheer increase in urban numbers, London's population roughly doubling between 1500 and 1600, placed ever greater strain on the system, turning narrow alleys into places where the background odor of waste mingled more insistently with the smells of baking bread, tanning leather, and open drains. In the countryside, where the majority still lived, the rhythms changed even more slowly. A yeoman farmer in the English shires or a tenant cultivator in the French countryside might now benefit from slightly larger communal pits dug by village labor, shared among several households and relocated every few seasons when full. Chamber pots of sturdier stoneware, traded at weekly markets, offered small comforts for nighttime use, especially valued by women during the later stages of pregnancy or after childbirth. Children continued to learn the practicalities early, stepping into the fields or behind the hedgerows during daylight hours, while the family's waste contributed directly to the fertility of the very plots that sustained them. Religious shifts brought new emphases. Protestant emphasis on personal discipline sometimes translated into stricter household rules about cleanliness, but the material constraints of water carriage and seasonal weather remained unchanged. Winter freezes still required servants or family members to clear blocked chutes with iron hooks, and summer rains could overwhelm backyard pits. Yet these challenges were met with the same generational knowledge that had served their forebears. Monasteries that survived in Catholic regions continued their orderly routines, their reredoors and lavatoria basins standing as quiet reminders of continuity amid the broader changes. The nobility and greater gentry adapted their great houses with similar pragmatism. At residences such as the expanded palaces along the Loire or the Tudor manor houses rising in the English countryside, architects incorporated garderobes into new wings, their chutes now sometimes fitted with better angled drops and separate service access to reduce odors in living quarters. Portable close stools traveled with hunting parties and royal progresses, their leather-lined buckets emptied discreetly by pages who regarded the task as ordinary service rather than indignity. In some grander establishments, the dual use of garderobes as wardrobes persisted, the rising ammonia still valued for preserving fine woolens and furs against pests, an economical solution that quietly highlighted the era's resourcefulness. Yet even here the pressures of growing households and more frequent visitors tested the limits. During extended stays at court or on progress, the volume of waste could overwhelm local arrangements, forcing reliance on temporary pits dug by servants or the nearest riverbank. Medical writers of the period, influenced by both traditional Galenism and emerging observations, continued to advise moderation and regular evacuation, recommending aromatic washes for cloths and sponges while warning against corrupted air from overflowing cesspits. These texts, now more widely available through printing, reached a broader audience than ever before, yet their practical recommendations built directly upon the systems already in daily operation rather than proposing radical alternatives. Public bathhouses, or stews, retained their place in urban life through the mid-16th century, though moralists in both Protestant and Catholic regions viewed them with increasing suspicion. In cities where they survived, the heated tubs and coarse cloths offered a respite from the day's accumulated grime, especially before market days or after illness, complementing the routines of the privy without replacing them. The water itself, drawn from rivers or wells, was rarely pristine, yet the ritual of washing represented a deliberate act of bodily care that coexisted with the broader environment of shared waste. For apprentices and journeymen whose work kept them away from home for long hours, these facilities or the nearest public latrine became essential pauses in the workday, their brief conversations over the benches underscoring the communal nature of necessity. The night soil trade, meanwhile, flourished as never before. Licensed collectors moved through the streets in the small hours, their carts now sometimes equipped with tighter lids and drawn by stronger horses to handle the increased volume. The contents sold at premium to market gardeners who supplied the swelling urban markets. This economy of waste remained one of the period's most understated efficiencies, turning what later ages would see as mere filth into a valued resource that sustained the very food supply of the towns. The lived experience across these decades revealed quiet contradictions that reward careful attention. A prosperous cloth merchant in Florence or a lawyer in Paris might enjoy a private garderobe in his townhouse, its stone chute angled away from the kitchen well, while his apprentices in the attic relied on a shared chamber pot emptied into the street gutter each morning. Women managing large households kept warmed vessels near the hearth in winter, easing the discomfort of nighttime use without drawing attention to the act. Children learned discretion early, yet the crowded tenements offered little true privacy, and the body's demands during illness or festival seasons could turn routine tasks into sources of quiet anxiety. Heavy rains or summer heat exacerbated the odors that no amount of lavender or rue could fully mask, and civic records show repeated fines for householders whose cesspits overflowed into neighboring properties. Yet within these constraints people maintained order. Fresh rushes scented with herbs covered the floors. Hands were washed before meals with whatever water was available, and the practical logic of the age held that waste, properly managed, supported rather than threatened daily life. The discomfort was real, the solutions imperfect, but they functioned within a world that valued communal survival and resource husbandry above modern notions of sterility. As the later decades of the 16th century unfolded, these pressures intensified with further population growth, the expansion of trade, and the occasional outbreaks of plague that reminded contemporaries of the vulnerabilities built into their arrangements. In London under Elizabeth I, new building regulations attempted to improve drainage in the narrower wards, yet the fundamental reliance on hand labor and river flows persisted. Similar efforts appeared in Paris and the cities of the Low Countries, where councils expanded the network of public latrines and tightened fines for street fouling. Printed broadsheets offered householders advice on the placement of privies and the use of quicklime in pits to reduce odors, advice that built upon rather than supplanted older customs. Travelers along the expanding roads carried portable stools or relied on the hospitality of inns and monasteries where facilities remained more predictable than those found in open fields. Through all these variations, the central truth endured. The most private of acts remained woven into the larger tapestry of labor, faith, economy, and environment, adapting slowly to new realities while retaining the practical wisdom of generations. Even as the century drew toward its close, the systems that had served the Middle Ages continued to answer the body's unchanging needs in ways that felt both familiar and enduring. The arrival of new plants and spices through global trade added subtle layers to the masking of odors, and architectural tastes in wealthier homes favored slightly more secluded arrangements. Yet the core dependence on chamber pots, garderobes, and night soil collection showed no sign of vanishing. In the workshops of carpenters and masons, commissions for new civic buildings sometimes included integrated latrine blocks that echoed older monastic designs, their channels and seats representing continuity amid change. Stories brought back by merchants from distant lands spoke of different facilities, yet these remained curiosities that did little to alter the daily realities at home. The quiet ingenuity of the age lay in its capacity to absorb fresh influences while preserving what had proven reliable across centuries of upheaval. What becomes especially apparent in these transitional years is how the daily negotiation with waste connected individuals to the broader structures of their society, its agricultural cycles, its civic regulations, and its evolving understandings of health and propriety. The discomfort never vanished. It was simply lived with, managed, and woven into the fabric of ordinary existence in ways that continue to illuminate the texture of the past. And as the 17th century approached with its own political and economic transformations, Those same practical systems would encounter yet another wave of pressures from rapid urban expansion, shifting medical theories, and the gradual accumulation of experience that would test their limits in new and revealing ways. As the 17th century approached with its own political and economic transformations, those same practical systems would encounter yet another wave of pressures from rapid urban expansion, shifting medical theories, and the gradual accumulation of experience that would test their limits in new and revealing ways. In the opening decades of the 1600s, across much of Europe, the garderobe, the chamber pot, and the public latrine remained the dominant solutions for a necessity that had changed little in its fundamental demands. Even as cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam swelled with new inhabitants drawn by trade and opportunity, the medieval inheritance proved durable. Many Tudor and early Stuart manor houses and town residences still featured stone or timber garderobes built into exterior walls, their chutes dropping waste into moats, rivers, or deep cesspits that were periodically emptied by night soil men under cover of darkness. In a typical prosperous merchant's house in Cheapside or the Marais, the morning routine began with the use of a close stool, often a finely carved wooden box concealing a glazed earthenware pot, before a servant carried it down to the courtyard or street to be taken to the nearest public facility or lay stall. These public latrines, some still perched over the Thames or the Seine, saw heavier traffic than ever before as populations grew, their benches worn smooth and their maintenance a constant concern for civic officials who issued repeated proclamations against fouling the streets. The lived experience retained much of the quiet discomfort and practical adaptation that had characterized the later Middle Ages. Winter mornings brought the sharp chill of unheated privy chambers, where the stone or wood absorbed the cold overnight, making even a brief visit an act of endurance. Chamber pots, now sometimes fitted with tighter lids and handles for easier handling, were essential for women, children, and the elderly who preferred not to venture outside in darkness or bad weather. Servants and apprentices bore the daily labor of emptying and rinsing these vessels, often rinsing them with water drawn from courtyard pumps or wells that themselves had to be guarded against contamination from nearby cesspits. Medical writers of the period, influenced by both traditional humoral theory and newer chemical ideas, continued to stress the importance of regular bodily evacuation to prevent the buildup of corrupt matter, advising the use of aromatic herbs such as lavender, rosemary, and wormwood to sweeten the air in close rooms. Fresh rushes or, in wealthier homes, early forms of matting still covered floors, and hands were washed before meals with whatever clean water was available. Small rituals that spoke to an ongoing awareness of bodily care amid the broader environment. What feels particularly noteworthy is how economic realities continued to shape even the most private acts. The night soil trade remained a vital, if lowly, occupation. Licensed collectors moved through the streets in the pre-dawn hours, their carts laden with the contents of cesspits and privy buckets, which were then sold to market gardeners on the outskirts of the city. This recycling loop was not seen as degrading but as a sensible use of resources in an agricultural society where every bit of fertility counted. In times of rapid urban growth, however, the volume of waste sometimes overwhelmed the capacity of collectors and rivers alike. Heavy rains could cause overflows, turning alleys into unpleasant channels, while summer heat intensified odors that no amount of scent could fully disguise. Civic authorities responded with stricter bylaws, fining householders for improper disposal and attempting to enforce the use of designated facilities. Yet enforcement remained uneven and dependent on local constables. In rural areas where the majority of the population still lived, change arrived even more gradually. Peasant and yeoman households relied on backyard pits or simple earth privies shared among families, supplemented by chamber pots for nighttime use. The contents, once the pit filled, were dug out and spread on the fields, maintaining the same closed agricultural cycle that had sustained communities for centuries. During periods of war or harvest, when labor was stretched thin, these arrangements could become more challenging, forcing greater improvisation. Religious and cultural attitudes continued to frame the experience with a blend of acceptance and modesty. Sermons and conduct books reminded people that the body's functions were part of the natural order, to be handled discreetly but without excessive shame. For the nobility and gentry, greater resources allowed for slightly more refined arrangements. In grand country houses and palaces, multiple garderobes served different wings, some with improved ventilation shafts that drew odors upward more effectively. Portable close stools accompanied royal progresses and military campaigns, their use managed by dedicated servants. Yet even here, the fundamental technology remained rooted in the medieval past. During the political upheavals of the mid-17th century, the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War on the continent, armies on the march relied on rudimentary latrine trenches or simply the open countryside, highlighting how quickly the comforts of fixed structures could disappear in times of conflict. As the century progressed through the 1630s and 1640s, the pressures of urban expansion and periodic plague outbreaks tested these long-standing systems in increasingly visible ways. London's population continued to climb, putting strain on the old infrastructure of the city wards. Similar growth occurred in Paris and other major centers. Physicians and reformers began to speak more urgently about the dangers of corrupted air from accumulated waste, linking foul odors to outbreaks of disease in ways that built upon but intensified earlier miasma concerns. Yet the practical solutions evolved slowly: more frequent cleaning of public latrines, occasional attempts at better drainage channels, and greater use of quicklime in cesspits to reduce smells. Printed household guides offered detailed advice on the placement and maintenance of privies, reflecting a growing interest in domestic order. The experience for ordinary people remained one of daily negotiation with necessity. A baker's family in a narrow London lane might use a chamber pot in the upper room at night, its contents carried down by the eldest child at first light to a public privy or lay stall. A farmer's wife in the surrounding countryside would step out to the family pit before preparing the morning meal, the rhythms dictated by season and weather. The discomfort was accepted as part of existence, much as one accepted the smoke from hearths or the mud of unpaved streets. Small comforts: a cushion on a privy seat, a warmed pot in winter, a handful of clean straw or cloth for wiping, made the reality more bearable for those who could afford them. By the later decades of the century, subtle shifts were beginning to appear in the wealthiest quarters and in the thinking of natural philosophers and urban planners, as ideas about improvement and public health gained ground. New building projects in rebuilt areas sometimes incorporated more systematic drainage, and there was growing discussion of the benefits of better water supply and waste removal. Yet the core medieval-derived practices, the chamber pot, the garderobe chute, the hand-emptied cesspit, the night soil cart, continued to serve the majority of the population, carrying forward the practical logic of earlier centuries into a new era of scientific curiosity and expanding cities. These accumulated experiences and mounting pressures set the stage for more deliberate attempts at reform in the years ahead, as societies grappled with the challenge of managing human waste on an ever larger scale while still relying on many of the same time-honored methods. These accumulated experiences and mounting pressures set the stage for more deliberate attempts at reform in the years ahead, as societies grappled with the challenge of managing human waste on an ever larger scale while still relying on many of the same time-honored methods. In the early decades of the 17th century, the close stool and the chamber pot remained the everyday reality for the vast majority, their forms refined by generations of use but unchanged in their fundamental dependence on human labor and simple materials. In prosperous households across London, Paris, or Amsterdam, a merchant or gentleman might sit upon a finely carved commode, a wooden box resembling a piece of furniture, concealing a removable pewter or ceramic pan beneath the seat. Its lid fitted more snugly than earlier designs to contain odors during the long winter nights. Servants emptied these vessels each morning, often at the regulated hour around 10 in the evening in some cities where bylaws still permitted the cautious pouring from upper windows with a warning cry that echoed the older gardyloo. The contents made their way to cesspits dug beneath yards or cellars, or to the nearest public lay stall outside the walls, where nightmen, working under cover of darkness to spare sensitive noses, loaded their carts and hauled the night soil to market gardens on the urban fringes. This trade, though essential, was sometimes met with indifference. In parts of England, farmers could have the material for free or even receive payment to take it away, as abundant animal dung and other fertilizers reduced its perceived value compared to the labor of collection and transport. The lived discomfort of these arrangements persisted in ways that reveal the quiet endurance of ordinary people. A family in a narrow London alley might keep a simple chamber pot, often called a goes-under for its place beneath the bed, ready for nighttime use by children or the elderly, its earthenware surface cool to the touch in unheated rooms. Women managing households found these portable solutions indispensable during pregnancy or illness, warming the pot with a brick from the hearth to ease the chill. Servants and apprentices bore the heavier burden, carrying slops down steep stairs and through streets that, despite repeated civic proclamations, still ran with the mingled filth of waste, rainwater, and household refuse. Public latrines, where they existed, offered rows of seats over rivers or channels, but they were crowded on market days and required constant maintenance to prevent blockages that could back up into neighboring properties. In rural districts, backyard pits or simple earth privies served much as they had for centuries. Their contents eventually spread on fields to enrich the soil for the next season's crops, though heavy rains or poor drainage could turn the task into a muddy ordeal. Medical observers, drawing on both traditional teachings and newer empirical notes, warned of the dangers of corrupted air from overflowing cesspits, yet the practical response remained one of incremental adjustment, more frequent raking of streets, occasional use of quicklime to temper odors, and the steady rhythm of nightmen whose work kept the urban metabolism turning. What strikes many today as surprising is how these systems coexisted with growing scientific curiosity without immediate transformation. Natural philosophers and physicians of the period discussed the body's humors and the perils of miasma with increasing precision, yet their writings largely endorsed the familiar practices: prompt evacuation, careful placement of privies away from wells, and the rinsing of cloths or sponges with vinegar or herbal infusions. In grander residences, such as those of the Stuart court or French nobility, multiple garderobes or close stools served different wings, sometimes accompanied by servants whose discreet attendance reflected older customs of rank and privacy. During times of political turmoil, the English civil wars or continental conflicts, armies on the march dug rudimentary trenches or simply used the open countryside, stripping away even these modest comforts and reminding everyone how fragile the arrangements could be when removed from settled life. Plague outbreaks, recurring through the century, heightened awareness of foul odors and prompted temporary civic efforts to clear gutters and inspect cesspits more rigorously. But the core reliance on hand-carried waste and river flows endured because the alternatives demanded resources and engineering that lay beyond most communities' reach. As the century moved into its middle decades, urban growth in centers like London and Paris placed ever greater strain on the inherited infrastructure. The rebuilding after the Great Fire of 1666 in London brought some localized improvements, wider streets in parts of the city and attempts at better drainage. But many rebuilt houses still incorporated the familiar close stools and chamber pots, their contents collected by the same nightmen whose carts rumbled through the pre-dawn hours. In Amsterdam, where water management was a constant civic concern, canals served as both thoroughfares and receiving waters for waste, their tidal flows helping to disperse what the public facilities could not contain. The night soil trade continued to function as an understated economy. In some districts, collectors paid householders small sums or performed the service gratis in exchange for the valuable manure, while in others the material accumulated until it had to be removed at public expense. For the laboring poor, the chamber pot under the bed or a shared privy in the courtyard remained the norm, its daily emptying a task often assigned to the youngest members of the household. Religious and cultural attitudes framed these necessities with a blend of practicality and modesty. conduct books and sermons reminded readers that the body's functions were part of God's creation, to be managed discreetly yet without false delicacy. The experience varied by season and circumstance in ways that layered small hardships into the background of daily existence. Summer heat intensified the odors rising from streets and pits, making the evening emptying of chamber pots a moment of reluctant necessity, while winter freezes turned liquid waste into stubborn blocks that servants cleared with hooks and hot water. Feasts, fasts, and festivals altered the body's rhythms, sending apprentices or market women hurrying to the nearest public convenience during long workdays. Travelers along the expanding roads carried portable close stools or relied on the hospitality of inns, where facilities ranged from rudimentary pits to more orderly arrangements modeled on older monastic designs. Even in the royal palaces, where resources allowed for greater refinement, the fundamental technology echoed the medieval past: stone chutes or wooden commodes that required regular service by dedicated staff. Small comforts accumulated over time: better fitted lids on pots, cushions on seats for those who could afford them, and the occasional scattering of ash or earth in privies to aid decomposition and reduce smell, experiments that reflected a growing domestic interest in order. By the closing years of the 17th century, the accumulated weight of urban expansion, repeated epidemics, and the slow dissemination of ideas about public health began to encourage more systematic thought among planners and reformers. In London and other major cities, proposals emerged for improved street cleaning and the regulation of cesspit placement, while natural philosophers pondered the chemistry of decomposition and the potential for better water supplies. Yet the everyday reality for most people remained rooted in the practical systems that had served their grandparents and great-grandparents. The chamber pot passed quietly among family members at night, the nightman's cart in the darkness, the public latrine benches worn by generations of use. These arrangements, imperfect and sometimes deeply unpleasant by later standards, functioned within the constraints of labor, materials, and social organization that defined the age, connecting the most private acts to the larger rhythms of agriculture, trade, and civic life. The quiet resilience of these methods, tested by a century of growth and upheaval, pointed toward the threshold of new experiments in the decades that followed, as Enlightenment thinkers and urban authorities began to envision more ambitious solutions while the old routines continued to answer the body's unchanging needs for millions across Europe. The quiet resilience of these methods, tested by a century of growth and upheaval, pointed toward the threshold of new experiments in the decades that followed, as Enlightenment thinkers and urban authorities began to envision more ambitious solutions while the old routines continued to answer the body's unchanging needs for millions across Europe. In the opening years of the 18th century, the chamber pot and the close stool remained the unremarkable foundation of daily relief for nearly every household, their forms now often refined by the cabinet makers of the age yet still reliant on the same hand labor and simple materials that had served their ancestors. In a fashionable London townhouse or a Parisian hotel particulier, a gentleman or lady might retire to a small closet containing a commode, a handsome wooden cabinet designed to resemble an ordinary piece of furniture, its hinged lid concealing a removable ceramic or pewter pan that could be lifted out and carried away by a servant without drawing undue attention. These vessels, sometimes lined with a thin layer of sawdust or ash to absorb moisture, were emptied each morning into the household cesspit or handed to the nightmen who worked the streets before dawn, their carts rumbling over cobblestones as they collected the night's soil for sale to market gardeners on the city fringes. The trade itself persisted as a quiet but essential economy. In some districts, collectors paid modest sums for the privilege, while in others the material was taken away at public expense, its value fluctuating with the availability of other fertilizers and the demands of nearby agriculture. The lived experience for ordinary people retained the same blend of quiet discomfort and pragmatic adaptation that had defined earlier centuries. A family in a modest lodging in Spitalfields or the faubourgs of Paris might keep a simple earthenware chamber pot, still referred to in household accounts as a goes-under or pot de chamber, tucked beneath the bed for nighttime use, its cool surface a familiar sensation in unheated rooms where the fire had long since died. Women managing large households or recovering from childbirth found these portable solutions indispensable, often warming the pot with a brick from the hearth or lining it with clean rags to ease the chill. Servants and apprentices bore the heavier daily labor, carrying slops down narrow stairs and through streets that, despite repeated civic efforts at sweeping, still bore the traces of waste. Rainwater and household refuse. Public latrines, where they existed in larger numbers along the Thames or the Seine, offered rows of seats overflowing water or channels. Yet they were crowded during market hours and required constant attention from wardens to prevent blockages that could foul neighboring cellars or yards. In rural villages across England, France, and the German lands, backyard pits or simple earth privies continued to serve much as they had for generations. Their contents eventually dug out and spread on the fields to nourish the coming crops, though heavy spring rains or prolonged freezes could turn the task into a muddy, unpleasant chore shared among neighbors. What many today might find quietly revealing is how Enlightenment ideas about reason, health, and public order began to influence discussions of these arrangements without immediately displacing the old practices. Physicians and philosophers writing in the spirit of the age spoke with greater precision about the dangers of corrupted air and the importance of cleanliness for preventing disease, yet their recommendations largely reinforced familiar habits. Prompt evacuation, careful placement of cesspits away from wells, and the rinsing of cloths or sponges with herbal infusions or vinegar. Printed household manuals, now more widely available, offered detailed advice on the maintenance of close stools and the proper depth of privies, reflecting a growing domestic interest in order and comfort. In wealthier residences, such as those of the aristocracy or prosperous merchants, multiple commodes served different chambers, sometimes accompanied by discreet attendants whose service reflected older customs of rank and privacy. Portable versions traveled with families on country visits or during the social season, their use managed behind screens or in temporary closets erected for the purpose. Even in royal palaces, where resources allowed for greater refinement, the fundamental technology echoed the past. Stone or wooden chutes in older wings alongside newer commodes that still required regular emptying by liveried staff. Urban growth in major centers like London, whose population approached 500,000 by the mid-18th century, placed increasing strain on these inherited systems. The rebuilding and expansion of streets brought some localized improvements, better paving in certain wards and occasional attempts at covered drains. But many new houses still incorporated the familiar close stools and chamber pots, their contents collected by the same nightmen whose work remained a constant, if uncelebrated, feature of city life. In Paris, where the Seine served as both thoroughfare and receiver of waste, authorities experimented with more systematic collection points and stricter regulations on household disposal, fining offenders who allowed cesspits to overflow into public spaces. Similar efforts appeared in Amsterdam and other trading cities, where water management had long been a civic priority, yet the core reliance on hand-carried waste and periodic carting endured because large-scale alternatives demanded engineering and investment that lay beyond most budgets. The night soil trade continued to function as an understated but vital loop in the urban economy. Farmers on the outskirts valued the material for its richness, and collectors adapted their routes to serve the growing number of households, sometimes working in teams to handle the volume before daylight revealed their labor to sensitive noses. The experience varied sharply by class and season, revealing small layers of hardship woven into the background of everyday existence. Summer heat intensified the odors rising from streets and pits, making the evening emptying of chamber pots a reluctant necessity carried out as swiftly as possible, while winter freezes turned liquid waste into stubborn blocks that servants cleared with iron hooks and buckets of hot water drawn from the kitchen. Feasts, market days, and periods of illness altered the body's rhythms, sending apprentices, market women, or household servants hurrying to the nearest public convenience during long hours away from home. Travelers along the improved turnpike roads carried portable commodes or relied on the hospitality of coaching inns, where facilities ranged from rudimentary pits behind the stable to more orderly arrangements in the better establishments. Children learned the practicalities early, stepping into the yard or behind a hedge during daylight hours, while the elderly or infirm kept chamber pots close at hand, their use a quiet acknowledgement of the body's unchanging demands. Religious and cultural attitudes continued to frame these necessities with a blend of practicality and modesty. Conduct books reminded readers that the body's functions were part of the natural order created by Providence, to be managed discreetly yet without false delicacy. By the middle decades of the 18th century, subtle experiments with new technologies began to appear among the most inventive minds, yet they remained rare and often impractical for widespread adoption. Early water closets, such as those designed by inventors like Alexander Cumming or Joseph Bramah, featured valves and flushing mechanisms that promised greater convenience, but they were expensive, prone to freezing or leaking, and required a reliable water supply that few households possessed. In grand country houses or select London residences, a few such devices were installed as novelties or status symbols, their use limited to the family and favored guests while servants still managed the older commodes and cesspits elsewhere in the building. For the vast majority, artisans, laborers, farmers, and the urban poor, the chamber pot under the bed, the backyard pit, and the nightman's cart remained the steady realities of life, their rhythms dictated by the same material constraints of labor, water, and seasonal weather that had shaped the Middle Ages. Civic authorities in growing cities issued more frequent ordinances for street cleaning and cesspit inspection, and Enlightenment reformers spoke of the benefits of better ventilation and drainage, yet the practical change was gradual and uneven, layered atop rather than replacing the old systems. The quiet accumulation of these pressures and small innovations set the stage for more noticeable shifts in the later years of the century, as urban authorities and private builders began to explore ways of integrating improved sanitation into new housing developments while the familiar routines of daily relief continued to sustain daily life for millions. In the workshops of cabinet makers and plumbers, commissions for commodes and early flushing devices reflected a growing interest in domestic comfort, even as the night soil carts still made their pre-dawn rounds and chamber pots were passed quietly among family members at night. These arrangements, imperfect by later standards yet deeply embedded in the social and economic fabric of the age, connected the most private acts to the larger rhythms of agriculture, trade, civic regulation, and philosophical inquiry, adapting slowly to fresh ideas while retaining the practical wisdom that had carried forward across centuries. And as the century drew toward its close amid revolutions in politics and industry, those same systems would face yet another wave of challenges and possibilities born of rapid population growth and the first stirrings of large-scale public health thinking. Those same systems would face yet another wave of challenges and possibilities born of rapid population growth and the first stirrings of large-scale public health thinking in the closing years of the 18th century and the opening decades of the 19th, as the Industrial Revolution gathered pace and transformed not only factories and transport but the intimate textures of daily life across Britain and much of continental Europe. In the new manufacturing towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire, where populations doubled and redoubled within a single generation, the old reliance on chamber pots, backyard privies, and night soil carts was suddenly tested by densities never before seen in European cities. A cotton spinner's family crammed into a single room in a back-to-back terrace might keep a simple earthenware pot beneath the bedstead for nighttime use, its contents carried down narrow stairs each morning by the youngest child and emptied into a shared midden at the end of the row, a shallow pit or wooden box that served half a dozen households and was rarely emptied thoroughly because the nightmen's carts could not navigate the cramped courts. In summer, the smell hung heavy over the alleys, mingling with coal smoke and the damp of unpaved yards. In winter the pit froze solid, forcing residents to break the surface with whatever tools lay at hand or simply add another layer of ashen earth until the thaw came. The discomfort was not abstract. It was the background against which meals were eaten, children were raised, and long factory shifts began before dawn. What feels quietly ironic in retrospect is how the very engines of progress, steam power, canal networks, and mass migration from the countryside, intensified rather than relieved these ancient pressures. In London, whose population surged past 1 million by 1815, The Thames continued to serve as both highway and open sewer, its banks lined with the same public latrines and private cesspits that had existed for centuries, now receiving the waste of far more people than the river's sluggish tides could comfortably disperse. Wealthier households in Mayfair or the newly built terraces of Bloomsbury might install one of the early patented water closets. Devices like those of Alexander Cumming in 1775 or Joseph Bramah in 1778, with their S-bend traps and pull handles, but these remained expensive curiosities, prone to leaking or freezing, and often connected to the same overloaded cesspits beneath the house. Servants still carried slops from the upper floors in many homes, and the night soil trade persisted as a nocturnal necessity. The collectors now sometimes organized into larger teams to cope with the volume. For the vast majority living in the new industrial districts, however, the chamber pot or the shared privy was the only practical reality. Medical men of the period noted with growing concern the link between foul air and outbreaks of fever, yet their observations translated slowly into civic action. Rural life, while slower to change, was not untouched. In the villages surrounding the new mill towns, families still used the familiar earth privies or chamber pots, but now many supplemented their income by taking in lodgers from the factories, which meant more waste for the same small pits and more frequent overflows into streams that supplied drinking water downstream. Farm laborers who had once spread their own night soil on the fields now found themselves competing with the cheaper, more abundant waste carted out from the cities. Material that was sometimes so liquid and so foul that it required mixing with ash before it could be used. The rhythms of harvest and winter still dictated when the pits were dug out and relocated, but the press of new mouths to feed and new wages to earn left less time for the careful maintenance that earlier generations had practiced. Women, who bore much of the domestic labor, managed the chamber pots for infants and the elderly with the same quiet pragmatism their mothers had known, warming the vessels by the hearth on frosty mornings and rinsing the cloths or sponges with whatever water could be spared from the kettle. Public health reformers, influenced by the utilitarian ideas gaining ground after 1800, began to speak more urgently about the need for systematic drainage and cleaner streets, yet their proposals met the same material limits that had always shaped these arrangements. Water had to be pumped or carried, sewers required capital that most towns lacked, and labor for cleaning remained cheap but finite. In Manchester or Leeds, local improvement acts authorized new street commissioners to sweep gutters and inspect cesspits, but enforcement was patchy and the underlying technology changed little. The nightmen continued their pre-dawn work, their carts now sometimes fitted with tighter covers to reduce spills. Yet the smell of their passage was still a familiar part of urban nights. For a factory hand returning home exhausted after 14 hours at the loom, the prospect of queuing for the single privy shared by 30 people or carrying a full pot down unlit stairs was simply another layer of fatigue woven into existence. Children learned early to manage without fuss, stepping into the yard or behind a wall during daylight hours, while the elderly or those weakened by factory dust kept pots close at hand, accepting the necessity without complaint because complaint changed nothing. As the 1820s and 1830s unfolded, the contrast between old and new became more visible in the built environment itself. In the elegant squares of the expanding middle-class suburbs, architects incorporated small water closets into new designs where water could be piped from newly improved company mains, though even here the waste still flowed into cesspits that required periodic emptying. In the older courts and cellars of the industrial slums, the medieval pattern persisted almost unchanged. A single privy for multiple families, its seat worn smooth by use, its pit overflowing in wet weather and attracting rats that found their way into kitchens and bedrooms. Medical reports from the period, increasingly detailed and statistical, documented the toll, recurrent cholera, typhus, and dysentery that struck hardest where waste accumulated. But the lived response remained one of endurance rather than overhaul. Householders sprinkled lime or ash when they could afford it, servants scrubbed chamber pots with sand and vinegar, and the night soil men adapted their routes to serve the new tenements, carrying away what the land still valued as fertilizer even as urban markets for vegetables grew alongside the factories. The experience varied not only by class but by the turning of the seasons and the demands of the new industrial calendar. Summer brought longer days and heavier diets of cheap bread and potatoes, increasing the frequency of use and the intensity of odors that no amount of carbolic or herbal masking could fully suppress. Winter imposed its own quiet hardships. Frozen pipes in the few houses that had them, ice forming in privy seats, and the extra labor of breaking up hardened waste before it could be carted away. Factory shifts that ran from before dawn until after dusk meant that many workers relieved themselves hurriedly in the mill yard privies. Often crude structures built over open ditches, or simply held on until the brief meal breaks, their bodies adjusting to the rigid timetable of the bell and the overlooker. Women working in the mills faced additional layers of discomfort during menstruation or pregnancy, relying on rags and quick visits to the shared facilities, while the noise and vibration of the machinery made even these brief pauses feel exposed. Through it all ran the same underlying acceptance that had characterized earlier centuries. The body's needs were natural, the solutions imperfect, and the daily negotiation with waste was simply part of the price of survival in a world of rapid change. By the 1840s, the accumulated pressures had begun to prompt more ambitious experiments in some quarters. Edwin Chadwick's influential reports on the sanitary condition of the laboring population highlighted the connection between foul water, overflowing cesspits, and disease with a clarity that earlier reformers had only hinted at, leading to new legislation that encouraged towns to build proper sewers and provide cleaner water supplies. Yet implementation was slow and uneven. Many places continued to rely on the old systems while the new infrastructure was planned, debated, and gradually laid down. In the grander country houses and select urban residences, the water closet had become more common, its flushing mechanism now improved and its connection to underground drains a mark of modernity. But for the millions living in the industrial heartlands, the chamber pot under the bed and the shared privy in the court remained the immediate reality. The night soil trade adapted once again, with collectors now sometimes working for municipal contracts rather than purely private arrangements. Yet the fundamental labor of hand-carrying and carting persisted because the transition to full water carriage systems required capital, engineering skill, and political will that took decades to assemble. What becomes especially clear when one lingers on these transitional years is how the most private of acts remained deeply entangled with the larger transformations of the age. Its factories and railways, its population surges and public health campaigns, its class divisions and domestic ideals. The discomfort never vanished. It was simply lived through, managed with the same generational resourcefulness that had carried the garderobe and the chamber pot forward from the Middle Ages into the Age of Steam. And as the middle decades of the 19th century approached, with their dramatic outbreaks of cholera and their landmark inquiries into urban sanitation, those same inherited systems would be pushed to a breaking point that would finally force more systematic change while still leaving echoes of the older routines in the daily lives of ordinary people. Those same inherited systems would be pushed to a breaking point that would finally force more systematic change while still leaving echoes of the older routines in the daily lives of ordinary people. The cholera epidemics that swept through Britain and much of Europe in the 1830s and 1840s brought the long-standing realities of waste management into sharp and terrifying focus, as overcrowded industrial districts where cesspits overflowed and shared privies served dozens of families became breeding grounds for the disease that physicians increasingly linked to contaminated water and foul air. In the cellars and back-to-back terraces of Manchester or the courts of London's East End, a laborer's wife might still rise before dawn to empty the family's single earthenware chamber pot into the shared midden at the end of the row, its contents mingling with those of 30 or more neighbors in a pit that was rarely cleared before it spilled over in heavy rain, sending a slow trickle of filth toward the nearest open drain or river. Children learned to step carefully around these hazards on their way to school or the factory gate, while the elderly or the sick kept pots close by the bed, their use a quiet necessity that offered no privacy and little dignity in rooms already thick with the smoke of coal fires and the damp of unventilated walls. The smell was not occasional but constant, a background presence that clung to clothing and hair and made even the simple act of eating feel precarious when the wind shifted. What many today might not fully grasp is how these outbreaks, devastating as they were, did not instantly sweep away the medieval-derived arrangements but instead exposed their limits in ways that prompted reformers to argue for change while most families continued to manage with what they had. Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population catalogued the overflowing privies and contaminated wells with unflinching detail, yet in practice the response was gradual. The Public Health Act of 1848 encouraged towns to appoint local boards and begin building sewers, but many places lacked the funds or the political will to act swiftly, leaving the night soil men and their carts still making their nocturnal rounds through the 1850s. In a typical working-class household, the chamber pot remained the first resort at night, passed among family members and carried downstairs each morning to the privy or the street gutter if the midden was full. Servants in middle-class homes in the new suburbs performed the same task for their employers, though here the vessel might be finer porcelain and the destination a small water closet with an early flushing mechanism that still emptied into a cesspit beneath the garden. The discomfort of these arrangements was accepted not as ignorance but as the unavoidable cost of city life, where factory wages paid the rent but left little for improvements that landlords were slow to provide. Rural districts, meanwhile, retained older patterns longer, though even here the influx of cheap urban night soil sometimes altered local habits. A farm laborer's cottage might still rely on a backyard earth closet or a simple pit, its contents dug out annually and spread on the fields, yet the arrival of cartloads from nearby towns introduced material that was wetter and more pungent, requiring mixing with ash or soil before it could be used safely. Women who managed the household found themselves negotiating these tasks alongside the demands of child-rearing and seasonal work, warming chamber pots by the hearth in winter and rinsing wiping cloths with water drawn from the well that itself risked contamination if the privy sat too close. The rhythms of the agricultural year still shaped the labor. Spring cleaning of pits coincided with planting, while harvest time left less opportunity for maintenance, forcing greater reliance on chamber pots kept near the hearth. Medical officers touring these areas noted the persistence of older customs, moss or rags for wiping, the occasional use of a sponge on a stick in better-off homes. Yet they also recorded how the sheer pressure of population growth was beginning to strain even these time-tested solutions. In the grander residences of the gentry and aristocracy, the transition appeared more advanced but remained uneven. Country houses built or renovated in the 1840s and 1850s sometimes incorporated purpose-built water closets with piped water from newly constructed reservoirs, their flushing mechanisms offering a degree of privacy and convenience unknown to earlier generations. Yet even here servants continued to manage the older commodes in guest rooms or servants' quarters, and the waste from these new devices often flowed into the same estate cesspits that had served for decades, requiring periodic emptying by the same teams of nightmen. During the social season in London, fashionable townhouses might boast one or two water closets on the upper floors, but the majority of the household still relied on chamber pots carried discreetly by maids, their contents joining the general flow to the Thames until the great sewer projects of the 1860s began to redirect it. The irony lay in how these innovations, meant to separate people from their waste, still depended on the labor of those whose own living conditions remained rooted in the older world. By the 1860s and 1870s, the landmark engineering efforts, most famously Joseph Bazalgette's vast interceptor sewers beneath London, began to transform the urban landscape in visible ways, channeling waste away from the river and reducing the worst of the surface filth that had plagued earlier decades. Yet, for ordinary families, the change was slower to reach the home. In the new model dwellings built by philanthropic societies or progressive local authorities, indoor water closets with proper traps and connections to the main sewer offered genuine relief, but these were exceptions reserved for the respectable working class or the lower middle class. In the older slums and industrial courts, the shared privy and the chamber pot endured, their daily use still a matter of negotiation among neighbors who timed their visits to avoid the worst queues or the most unpleasant conditions. The night soil trade contracted in areas served by sewers but persisted in others, the collectors now sometimes municipal employees rather than independent traders. their carts fitted with better seals yet still rumbling through the streets before dawn. Medical understanding had advanced, with germ theory gradually replacing miasma ideas, yet the practical reality for millions remained one of adaptation. Sprinkling carbolic acid in privies when affordable, rinsing pots with hot water from the copper, and accepting that the body's needs had to be met within the limits of housing that had been built for an earlier, less crowded age. The lived experience across these decades revealed quiet contradictions that continued to reward attention. A mill worker in Bradford might return home to a court where 30 people shared 2 privies, their seats slick with use and the pit below a constant source of worry during outbreaks of summer diarrhea, while his foreman in a nearby villa enjoyed a private water closet that flushed cleanly into the new sewer. Women, who bore much of the domestic burden, developed small strategies, keeping a spare pot for infants, using old newspapers or rags that could be burned afterward, or simply waiting until the children were asleep to avoid disturbing the household. But the discomfort remained real, especially during pregnancy or illness when the distance to the privy felt greater and the urgency more pressing. Children learned discretion early, yet the crowded conditions offered little true privacy, and the noise of factory life or the clatter of horses outside made even these moments feel exposed. Seasonal shifts still imposed their own hardships. Winter freezes that turned liquid waste to ice in outdoor privies. Summer heat that intensified odors no amount of lime or carbolic could fully mask. As the century drew toward its close, the spread of indoor plumbing in middle-class homes and the gradual extension of sewer networks into working-class districts marked a genuine shift. Yet echoes of the older routines lingered in the daily lives of the poor and in the habits of servants who still carried slops in houses that had not yet been fully modernized. The Great Stink of 1858 in London had forced Parliament to act, but the human experience of relief, of finding a quiet moment, of managing the body's demands without drawing attention, of living with the constant background awareness of waste, continued to connect people across class lines to the practical legacies of the Middle Ages. In the workshops of plumbers and builders, new designs for water closets with improved cisterns and traps promised greater reliability, while municipal engineers laid miles of pipe beneath the streets. Yet for many the chamber pot under the bed or the shared privy in the yard remained the immediate, tangible reality. These accumulating improvements and persistent older practices set the stage for the final widespread transition in the early years of the 20th century, as electricity, expanding water mains, and new building regulations began to bring the modern bathroom within reach of broader sections of society, while the last vestiges of hand-carried waste and night soil collection faded unevenly from town and country alike. These accumulating improvements and persistent older practices set the stage for the final widespread transition in the early years of the 20th century, as electricity, expanding water mains, and new building regulations began to bring the modern bathroom within reach of broader sections of society, while the last vestiges of hand-carried waste and night soil collection faded unevenly from town and country alike. In the years just before the First World War, a skilled workers' family in a newly built council house on the edge of Birmingham or Manchester might step into a small, tiled room containing the first indoor water closet the household had ever known. A simple porcelain bowl with a pull-chain cistern overhead and a connection to the expanding municipal sewer that carried everything away without the need for nightly emptying or the midnight rumble of carts. Yet for millions living in older terraces or rural cottages, the chamber pot under the bed or the earth privy at the bottom of the garden remained the daily reality well into the 1920s and 1930s. The transition was never uniform, shaped as it was by the cost of plumbing, the pace of local authority schemes, and the stubborn endurance of habits formed over centuries. In a typical working-class home in the industrial North, the morning ritual still began with the quiet passing of a white-glazed pot among family members before the youngest carried it downstairs to the shared yard privy, its wooden seat now sometimes fitted with a newer ceramic pan but still requiring manual flushing with a bucket of water drawn from the single cold tap in the scullery. The lived experience of this gradual shift carried its own quiet contradictions and small comforts. Electricity brought brighter bulbs to light the way down unheated corridors at night, Yet many households kept a chamber pot handy for children or the elderly who preferred not to venture outside in the dark or during winter freezes that could turn outdoor privies into icy hazards. Women, who continued to manage much of the domestic labor, found the new indoor closets a genuine relief during pregnancy or monthly cycles, no longer needing to balance modesty with the exposure of a shared yard facility, though the cistern's noisy rush sometimes felt startling in the quiet hours before dawn. In rural villages, where Maine's water and sewers arrived more slowly, the earth closet, now often improved with a simple bucket system or a layer of ash for deodorizing, persisted alongside the older pits, its contents still dug out seasonally and spread on allotments or fields by families who viewed the material as a practical resource rather than something to be hidden away. The night soil trade contracted sharply in cities with full sewer coverage, yet in outlying districts collectors still made their pre-dawn rounds, their work now regulated by local bylaws that required tighter lids and prompt removal to meet new public health standards. Medical understanding, shaped by germ theory and the lessons of the Great War, emphasized hand-washing and cleanliness with a precision unknown to earlier generations. Yet the practical advice in household manuals still echoed older concerns. Rinse the pot thoroughly, keep the seat scrubbed, and avoid letting waste stand too long. What feels subtly revealing about these early 20th century years is how the promise of modernity coexisted with the persistence of older discomforts in ways that varied sharply by class and region. In middle-class suburbs, the bathroom had become a small but distinct room of its own, often with a separate bath and basin supplied by hot water geysers, the water closet tucked discreetly behind a door that offered genuine privacy for the first time in many family histories. Servants in larger homes, however, might still carry slops from attic bedrooms or guest quarters where the new plumbing had not yet been extended, their daily tasks bridging the old world and the new. During the interwar period, council housing programs and private building booms accelerated the change. A young couple moving into a semi-detached villa in the 1930s could expect an indoor toilet as standard, its flushing mechanism now more reliable and its connection to the main drain a mark of respectable domestic life. Yet in the older slums slated for clearance, shared privies and chamber pots endured, their use a reminder that progress moved at the pace of rents and rates rather than ideals. Children growing up in these mixed environments learned both systems side by side, flushing with confidence in a friend's modern home while managing the bucket and ash routine at their own, absorbing the quiet lesson that bodily needs were met differently depending on the walls one lived within. The Second World War and its aftermath brought another layer of disruption and then acceleration. Bomb damage and post-war reconstruction cleared many of the worst Victorian courts, replacing them with new estates where indoor bathrooms were planned from the outset, complete with standardized porcelain fixtures and connections to expanded sewer networks. Rationing and material shortages meant that older chamber pots and commodes remained in use in damaged or temporary housing, their familiarity offering a small continuity amid the upheaval of evacuation and rebuilding. In the countryside, where agricultural labor still shaped daily rhythms, the earth closet or chemical toilet served remote farms long after urban areas had moved on, their maintenance a seasonal task shared by family members who valued the self-sufficiency it represented even as piped water slowly reached more isolated hamlets. Public health campaigns and school lessons reinforced the new expectations of hygiene, hot water, soap, and regular flushing. Yet the body's insistent timing still required negotiation, especially in households where the single bathroom served multiple generations or where shift work meant staggered use of the facilities. By the 1950s and 1960s, the modern bathroom had become the norm rather than the exception across much of Britain and Western Europe, its tiled surfaces, running hot water, and reliable flush marking a genuine break with the medieval inheritance that had lingered so long. In a typical suburban home, the morning routine now unfolded in privacy and comfort. A quick visit to the water closet, hands washed at the basin, the cistern refilling with a gentle gurgle that signaled the end of centuries of hand-carrying and night soil carts. Yet even here subtle echoes remained. Older relatives might keep a chamber pot in the bedroom out of habit or for nighttime convenience, and in some rural or lower-income areas the outdoor privy survived into the 1970s, its wooden door creaking open on frosty mornings while the family waited their turn. The discomforts of the past had not vanished entirely. They had simply been relocated or minimized, blocked drains after heavy use, the occasional power cut that left cisterns empty, or the quiet awareness that the sewer system downstream still required constant maintenance by unseen workers whose labor echoed the nightmen of earlier eras. Cultural attitudes shifted too. What had once been a communal or openly practical matter became more private, discussed less in everyday conversation, yet still shaped by class, region, and the lingering memory of how things used to be. The quiet accumulation of these changes and lingering traces pointed toward the later 20th century, when rising expectations of comfort, environmental awareness, and technological refinement would test the limits of water carriage systems themselves, while the most basic human necessity continued to connect people to the long arc of adaptation that stretched back through the Middle Ages and beyond. The quiet accumulation of these changes and lingering traces pointed toward the later 20th century, when rising expectations of comfort, environmental awareness, and technological refinement would test the limits of water carriage systems themselves, while the most basic human necessity continued to connect people to the long arc of adaptation that stretched back through the Middle Ages and beyond. In the 1970s and 1980s, the widespread adoption of standardized indoor bathrooms across much of Britain, Western Europe, and similar developed societies represented the culmination of more than a century of gradual engineering, yet it also introduced subtle new pressures that echoed older constraints in unexpected ways. Families moving into council estates or private suburban homes now took for granted the small tiled room containing a porcelain water closet, often in pastel shades of avocado or harvest gold, with a cistern mounted high on the wall or concealed in a low-level suite. The morning or nighttime ritual had become one of quiet privacy. A gentle pull on the chain or press of a button, the rush of water carrying everything away without the need for servants, nightmen, or chamber pots that had defined daily life for so many earlier generations. For those who had grown up with outdoor privies or shared facilities in the interwar years, this was a profound and often unremarked improvement in dignity and ease, allowing the body's demands to be met with minimal disruption to the rhythms of work, school, or family life. What feels quietly ironic in this era of apparent triumph is how the very success of water carriage systems soon revealed their own material limits, much as medieval cesspits had strained under urban growth centuries earlier. Rising environmental awareness in the wake of the 1970s energy crises and growing concern over water resources prompted water authorities to promote low-flow toilets and dual-flush mechanisms, designs that used significantly less water per use yet sometimes required users to adjust their habits, waiting for the cistern to refill or learning the difference between the half-flush for lighter needs and the full flush for heavier ones. In a typical British household of the period, the bathroom became a space of small negotiations. Children taught to conserve by not flushing unnecessarily, parents noting the quieter operation of newer models that reduced the once familiar gurgle, and older relatives who remembered the cold trek to the yard privy quietly appreciating the warmth of a heated floor or the convenience of a nearby basin for hand-washing. In rural districts or older properties not yet connected to full mains drainage, the earth closet or chemical toilet persisted into the 1980s and even the early 1990s, its bucket system or ash layer offering a self-contained practicality that connected directly to the resourcefulness of medieval peasants spreading night soil on fields. The night soil trade had largely vanished from urban centers, replaced by vast treatment plants operating far from view. Yet the labor of maintenance crews who cleared blockages or monitored sewer flows continued an unseen lineage of work that stretched back to the gong farmers and rakers of the Middle Ages. The lived experience across these decades reflected both the comforts of modernity and the persistence of small, everyday adaptations. A family in a 1980s semi-detached home might enjoy the privacy of a lockable door and soft toilet tissue far removed from the moss or linen rags of earlier times, yet still keep a spare roll close at hand and a plunger in the cupboard for the occasional blockage caused by overuse or older plumbing. Women managing households found the indoor facilities a genuine relief during pregnancy or menstruation, no longer needing to balance modesty with exposure in a shared yard, though the noise of the flush in thin-walled homes could sometimes feel intrusive in the quiet hours. Children absorbed hygiene lessons at school and through television campaigns that emphasized thorough hand-washing, building upon but greatly refining the vinegar rinses or herbal infusions recommended in medieval medical texts. In workplaces and public buildings, the standardization of accessible toilets reflected broader social changes, providing clean, private spaces that contrasted sharply with the multi-seated benches over rivers in medieval towns or the crowded public latrines of the Victorian era. Yet even here subtle discomforts lingered: the wait during peak hours in busy offices or shopping centers, the faint chemical scent of cleaning products that masked rather than eliminated odors, or the occasional power cut or water main failure that forced a return to emergency buckets or outdoor options reminiscent of older improvisations. As the 20th century drew toward its close and the 21st began, technological refinement continued at a measured pace, shaped by both consumer demand and growing ecological pressures. Dual-flush and low-flow designs became standard in new construction and retrofits, encouraged by building regulations and water company incentives, while manufacturers experimented with pressure-assisted systems and improved trap designs that reduced noise and enhanced performance without increasing consumption. In eco-conscious homes, some householders installed composting toilets or greywater recycling setups, reviving elements of the closed-loop resourcefulness that had sustained medieval agriculture and rural privies, though on a smaller, more controlled, and often more expensive scale. The cultural shift toward greater privacy meant that discussions of these matters became more discreet in everyday conversation, yet the basic human necessity remained a universal thread, linking people across class, region, and generation to the same practical realities of the body that had shaped life in castles, cottages, and tenements alike. In parts of the countryside or in lower-income urban areas where full modernization arrived more slowly, older fixtures or even outdoor facilities survived into the early 2000s, their wooden seats and manual flushing buckets offering a tangible reminder of how recently the transition had occurred for many families. Public health and building standards continued to evolve, with emphasis on accessibility for the elderly and disabled, ventilation to prevent condensation, and materials that could be cleaned easily with modern detergents. The discomforts of the past had not entirely disappeared. They had simply been minimized or relocated: the faint awareness of distant treatment plants working around the clock, the occasional sewer overflow during extreme weather that recalled medieval floods, or the quiet knowledge that even the most advanced systems still depended on infrastructure maintained by human labor. Seasonal rhythms still imposed small adjustments: heavier use during holiday gatherings or family illnesses, the need to conserve during summer droughts, or the comforting warmth of a heated seat in winter homes that had once known only the chill of stone garderobes. Through all these variations ran the same underlying acceptance that had characterized earlier centuries. The body's needs were natural, the solutions imperfect yet steadily improving, and the daily negotiation with waste remained quietly embedded in the larger structures of society. Its plumbing networks, its environmental policies, its domestic ideals, and its unspoken understandings of health and propriety. The quiet ingenuity of these late 20th and early 21st century arrangements becomes especially clear when one considers how they balanced rising expectations of comfort with the practical constraints of water supply, energy costs, and waste treatment on an ever larger scale. In newly built apartments or renovated Victorian terraces, the bathroom had become a space of calm efficiency, its fixtures designed for both function and subtle aesthetics, yet the fundamental act of relief still connected users to the long historical thread that began with the stone chutes of medieval castles and the shared pits of peasant cottages. As the new millennium unfolded, further refinements, sensor-activated flushes in public facilities, water-saving innovations driven by climate awareness, and even smart home monitoring of usage patterns continued to test and extend the systems that had replaced the chamber pot and the night soil cart, while in some remote or developing contexts older methods endured or were revived for sustainability. These accumulating adaptations and lingering traces of the past pointed toward ongoing challenges and possibilities in the decades ahead. As societies grappled with population pressures, resource limits, and the enduring human need for practical, dignified solutions to a necessity that has shaped daily life across every era. These accumulating adaptations and lingering traces of the past pointed toward ongoing challenges and possibilities in the decades ahead. As societies grappled with population pressures, resource limits, and the enduring human need for practical, dignified solutions to a necessity that has shaped daily life across every era. From the cold stone chutes of a 14th century garderobe, where a lord or lady sat in drafty privacy while servants later cleared the moat below, to the shared yard privy of a 19th century industrial court where 30 neighbors timed their visits around factory shifts, and on to the quiet privacy of a 21st century bathroom with its low-flow cistern and soft lighting, the story of this most basic act reveals a quiet continuity beneath the surface of technological change. What began as a patchwork of improvisation in the Middle Ages, shaped by wood scarcity, hand labor, religious teaching, and the agricultural value of night soil, evolved through centuries of urban strain, plague, industrial crowding, and public health reform into the systems we now take for granted. Yet each stage carried the same underlying truth. The body's demands were never ignored, only met within the material and social limits of the moment. Across that long arc, medieval people were not indifferent to comfort or cleanliness. They were resourceful within a world of carrying water by hand and relying on rivers or pits that doubled as fertilizer. The discomfort we imagine today was real. The chill of stone in winter, the pervasive background odor that no herb could fully erase, the lack of privacy in crowded tenements. But it was woven so deeply into daily existence that it rarely provoked the kind of revulsion a modern observer might feel. Instead, it prompted small, practical adaptations. The dual-purpose garderobe that preserved woolens from moths, the communal reredorer in a monastery flushed by a diverted stream, the night soil cart that sustained market gardens on the edge of town. As populations swelled and cities grew, those same constraints tested the old arrangements until reformers and engineers responded with sewers, water mains, and eventually the indoor water closet. Each innovation carried forward an echo of earlier ingenuity, the closed loop of waste and fertility reimagined in modern treatment plants, the emphasis on hygiene refined by germ theory, the quiet negotiation with seasonal rhythms and resource limits that persists even in our era of low-flow fixtures and composting experiments. What emerges from this long view is not a simple tale of progress from filth to perfection, but a more thoughtful reflection on human resilience and the slow, uneven nature of change. The systems that served the Middle Ages made practical sense to those who lived with them because they were shaped by the same pressures: labor, water, wood, faith, and agriculture that defined the age. Later generations inherited those constraints and gradually loosened them through collective effort, civic investment, and scientific understanding. Yet the fundamental act of relieving oneself has always connected individuals to the larger structures of their society. Its economy, its architecture, its unspoken understandings of health and dignity. The discomforts of the past were never uniform. They varied by class, by season, by region, and by gender, revealing quiet ironies and small comforts that reward careful attention rather than easy judgment. In our own time, with water scarcity and environmental limits once again prompting innovation, we find ourselves returning in subtle ways to older principles of conservation and closed loops, reminding us that the story is never truly finished. The history of how people went to the bathroom, then, is ultimately a history of how they lived, making do with what was available, adapting with quiet ingenuity, and finding order in the most intimate of necessities. It reminds us that even the most ordinary routines carry the weight of centuries, shaped by forces larger than any single life yet felt most keenly in the privacy of the moment. If any detail from this long journey through the past surprised you most, or if a particular era's arrangements feel hardest to imagine living with today, I would be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if these calm, thoughtful explorations of how people really lived have offered a gentle way to settle into the evening. I invite you to subscribe so the next unhurried journey through history finds you easily. Until then, thank you for listening.